Did you miss me? I'm back for a very special blame game on MSI and specifically Anxiety, Olleh, and Team Liquid. This will be pretty different than normal because it won't be as scripted and there'll probably be no in-game footage to really discuss, and it'll be much more high level. For those of you out of the loop, Team Liquid went 0-2 on their first day, and Olleh decided to bench himself due to nerves and having what seems to be anxiety attacks of some kind. Game 3, Joey subs in on the second day, and no surprise, Team Liquid kind of gets rolled before Olleh subs back into the fourth game. Since then, there's been a fair amount of discussion and interviews around this topic, and I wanted to chime in with my thoughts. Are fans really justified in getting upset at Olleh and Team Liquid in this situation? Now, it's tough to talk about because mental health and your mental state are things that vary wildly, and there's no way of knowing how anyone really feels. And it's the kind of thing where we don't even have as much access as we might want to, but I still think it's important to talk about. I'm going to kick things off with a story though. Bill Russell was an 11-time NBA champion and one of the greatest winners of all time. He is also known for violently vomiting before the games that he played. It was so loud that his teammates would hear him doing it, and John Havlicek noted that it almost became a bit of a rallying cry and calming effect to the rest of the team because it meant you knew that Bill Russell was getting ready to go. I also heard a story about him that I'm struggling to dig up right now where for a period of time doctors and people told him that this wasn't healthy and he should try and stop doing it. It can damage his esophagus and all that stuff, and he tried to suppress it for a period of time, and it just made them play worse, and he was not able to be as good as he was used to being. And so after a period of time, he said, screw it. This is how I get ready for games, and this is what I'm gonna do. Obviously, everyone in the world feels stressed, and particularly athletes do too, going out in front of millions of people and performing. Even the best of the best, Bill Russell, this insanely dominant player on the winningest team ever, basically, felt stressed. You can't imagine how people playing them must have felt. Given that, it's obvious that anxiety and stress affects everyone differently to different levels, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach to how to deal with it. It's also obvious that a lot of people don't deal with it well. You could say vomiting before games seems like a terrible approach, but it worked for Bill Russell, whereas for somebody else, getting nauseous before games might be terrible. Probably similar to a lot of viewers like you, I myself am no stranger to stress and anxiety. I don't want to get into why and how and all this stuff happened. Maybe that's a video for another time. But for a long period of time, starting in college, I could not eat in the morning. I was always nauseous for the first 4 to 6 hours of the day, and this went on for 4 or 5 years. And during this time, I also vomited before basically anything of significance to me. Job interviews, parties, dates, LCS matches, any of that stuff would let me throw up, or even just stressful situations of any kind. Eventually I saw a psychologist for it, didn't help it done, but it was useful, I guess. And eventually I got over these symptoms, but even to this day, I still get physiological reactions to stress when it's really bad. During that time where offline TV was going through a very tumultuous time and I was trying to fix everything, I was so stressed out about it that I broke out in a rash that was like really itchy hives and stuff all over my body just from being so worried about making sure things worked out. I've also had pretty minor, I would say probably panic attacks where for 10 to 30 minutes I felt like I wasn't getting oxygen. Like I knew mechanically my body was breathing, but it didn't feel like the air was actually doing anything for me, and it just felt like I couldn't breathe. These are some things that I actually had a little bit of knowledge about before it happened to me, so it wasn't something that worried me out too bad. Now, despite all my struggles with this, it's something that I'm still pretty happy to feel stressed out often. It's a sign that I'm doing something important and that I care about what I'm doing, and I enjoy a healthy level of stress. And I would say, you have to be careful about that stuff, but it's important to feel stressed about things. Now, obviously, it's pretty difficult to try and do things during these kinds of physiological responses that you're having to stress and anxiety, especially when what you're expected to do is go out there and play a game that's very difficult at the highest level possible. And luckily, I have a little bit of experience with people who were expected to do that. During my time on Curse and Team Liquid, Voyboy and Dominate were two players who struggled with these kinds of things. Dom in particular has a great 25-minute video where he goes out and discusses having panic disorder, learning about it, and then playing through panic attacks. And he's actually the guy who, like, where I learned about panic attacks, so that when I had my couple minor ones, I was like, oh, I'm fine. I just need to kind of like get through this and convince myself that I am getting oxygen. But for him, it was a thing where he didn't know what was happening, and for a while, I wasn't sure if he was dying or whatnot, before finally, over the course of the years that he played the game, getting over those kinds of things. And he talks about how it was difficult for him to maintain focus on the game while needing to use headspace to convince himself that, no, I'm not dying, I am getting oxygen, I'm clearly talking, there's something going on here. And so that would make his brain about gameplay kind of go on autopilot while he dealt with the effects of this. Voyboy is a player who had some nausea problems and threw up before some games and things like that due to the stress and things like that. And for a while, we weren't sure if it was ulcer or whatnot. He's another guy who learned to kind of like play through the stress and anxiety, but it was something that I think a lot of players across the league all deal with to some degree, and the way it impacts everyone, like I said, is different, and there's no one-size-fits-all kind of reaction to it and solution for it. That brings me to TL and the Olleh situation. It's really difficult to talk about this, so I'll just go out and say what I think right at the beginning. I actually do think the blame is justified. Now, it's very important to note that hate is not acceptable, attacking people for this is not acceptable, but I do think that the community is fair to expect more out of these individuals and this group. Now, it's especially difficult to talk about because it's a mental health situation and we don't have visibility really on why this happened. So we don't know if it's just Olleh having way too much self-doubt and allowing it to consume him, if the team was too critical in their feedback to Olleh, whether the coaching staff and the sports psychologists that they do have didn't mentally prepare the team correctly for this. It's really hard to point the finger at any one thing, and I doubt it is specifically any one thing. Every team out there is going through nerves and anxiety. I guarantee you every player is a bit anxious. I also know that a lot of those teams are making plenty of mistakes. It's not like Team Liquid was so much worse and getting blasted harder than anyone else. So it is upsetting to see that only Team Liquid is the only team that I can remember in the history of League of Legends having a player bench themselves after one day of a tournament. That is something to be upset about and discuss. It's also worth discussing if, after the nerves had become such an issue, if the course of action that they took was the right one. And I would actually argue that benching Olleh potentially was the right option. It's a situation where he had no confidence, Joey goes in, they lose that game pretty convincingly, and Joey does not look good, and Olleh sees, okay, the team is having problems, it's not all on me, and maybe it calms him down a little bit because in the last 2 days, Team Liquid has gone 3-1. And so they're starting to bounce back, and you can maybe say that these decisions that they've made once they've felt these nerves have been the correct ones. Once again, this is such a hard thing to talk about because you don't know the situation. You're not trying to hurt anyone's feelings, but at the end of the day, you deserve the questions that follow the fact that the nerves were so bad. Is this a player you can rely on in high-stress situations to not be nervous and play substantially worse than they're expected to? Some people, like Bill Russell, vomit and play better. Olleh does not appear to be that player, and I think it is fair to say that. Anyways, that's going to do it for this episode of The Blame Game. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope I brought something valuable to this conversation. Mentioned it a couple of times. It's a very difficult one to talk about. I'm obviously no psychologist or anything like that, so I could easily be wrong on a lot of things, but I'd really like to start and participate in the conversation and get some things wrong and get corrected along the way rather than just sit out on it. So I hope this was an enjoyable watch for you guys. I'll be doing a GLT tomorrow with Skara, so check that out. We'll be breaking down the group stage as well as predicting the knockout stage of the tournament, so I'll see you guys then.